Part 1. The encounter. General Nathaniel Carter had dedicated his life to serving his country, building a reputation of honor, courage, and discipline in the U.S. Army. A respected African-American leader and mentor to young soldiers, he had overcome countless challenges in his career. Despite being a four-star general, he lived by the values instilled in him since childhood: humility, patience, and resilience. Little did he know that on a calm Saturday evening, a casual outing would turn into an unforgettable test of his patience and grace. General Carter was on his way home from a family gathering. Dressed in simple civilian clothes, a navy blue jacket, khaki pants, and a baseball cap, he looked nothing like the high-ranking officer he was. That evening, he decided to stop by a grocery store in his quiet suburban neighborhood to pick up some items. It was a mundane task, yet it was here that his commitment to patience would be pushed to its limits. As he exited the store and headed to his car, he noticed a police cruiser parked nearby. The cop inside eyed him, and Nathaniel gave a friendly nod, hoping to keep the atmosphere light. He had grown accustomed to dealing with tension in all its forms, both on the battlefield and at home. But this time was different. As he placed his grocery bags in the trunk, he noticed the officer, a younger man with a rigid stance, approaching him. "Hey, you! What are you doing here?" the officer called out, his tone sharp and unwelcoming. Nathaniel looked up calmly, surprised by the hostility, but choosing not to let it rattle him. "I'm just loading my groceries, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer squinted at him, taking in his appearance from head to toe, then responded with a mocking tone. "I find it interesting that someone like you can afford to shop around here. Got any ID on you?" Nathaniel's calm demeanor remained, though his heart tightened a bit. He took a steady breath, nodding slightly. "Sure, officer. But if I may ask, is there a reason you're stopping me?" The officer's face twisted with irritation. "Don't get smart with me. Just show me some ID." Nathaniel pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license, keeping his movements slow and deliberate to avoid further escalation. As the officer inspected the ID, he clicked his tongue and smirked. "A general, huh? I find that hard to believe," he scoffed. "Sir, I am who my ID says I am," Nathaniel replied evenly, keeping his voice steady and controlled. But the officer wasn't convinced. "You're telling me a man like you is a general?" His mocking gaze was now filled with open hostility. "If you're really who you say you are, why don't you prove it?" Before Nathaniel could respond, the officer made a bold move. He grabbed Nathaniel's arm roughly, forcing him against the car. The sudden force was unexpected, and for a brief moment, Nathaniel's military training instincts kicked in, but he reined himself in, unwilling to escalate the situation. "Officer, please, there's no need for this," he said firmly, trying to defuse the situation. "I'm cooperating." The officer leaned in, his voice low and venomous. "Listen here, General. I don't know what kind of con you're running, but you're not fooling me. People like you don't belong in neighborhoods like this." Part 2. The Truth Revealed. Nathaniel's heart sank as he absorbed the officer's words. He had spent his life fighting for his country, yet here he was, treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. But he stayed calm, knowing his temper wouldn't serve him in this moment. "Officer, if you would just call the station and verify my ID, you'll see that everything is in order," he said, keeping his voice steady. But the officer wasn't interested in making calls or verifying information. Instead, he tightened his grip and sneered, "How about you just keep quiet and cooperate?" At this point, a few bystanders had started to gather, their eyes widening as they watched the scene unfold. Some even pulled out their phones, recording the encounter. Nathaniel's mind raced. He could assert his authority, but he feared that doing so would make matters worse, so he chose restraint. "I have nothing to hide, officer. I've spent over 30 years serving this country and have always respected law enforcement. I'm asking you to do the same." The officer's face reddened, a mix of embarrassment and frustration surfacing. He glanced at the crowd, noticing their concerned expressions. But instead of de-escalating, he took it as a challenge. His voice was filled with contempt as he spat, "Respect? Don't lecture me about respect. Let's see how much respect you have when you're in handcuffs." Before Nathaniel could respond, the officer moved to cuff him, his movements aggressive and unjustified. The crowd murmured in disbelief, some even calling out in protest. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around Nathaniel's wrists, a deep sadness washed over him. He had faced adversity on countless fronts, but this felt different. This felt personal. Just as the officer was about to lead Nathaniel to his cruiser, another car pulled up. Out stepped a police lieutenant, a middle-aged woman with a commanding presence. She had received calls from concerned citizens and arrived to assess the situation. "What's going on here, Officer Miller?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the commotion. The officer stiffened, caught off guard. "Lieutenant, this man was acting suspiciously. I was just handling the situation." The lieutenant's sharp eyes scanned Nathaniel, noting his calm composure despite the unjust treatment he had endured. She then looked back at Officer Miller with a mixture of suspicion and disappointment. "Did you verify his ID?" she asked, her voice laced with impatience. "He claims he's a general, but I wasn't buying it," Officer Miller muttered, avoiding her gaze. The lieutenant narrowed her eyes, unimpressed. "Well, let me take a look at that ID." Nathaniel, still calm, offered a respectful nod and showed his ID once again. The lieutenant took one glance, her eyes widening in recognition. She had seen his name before, had even heard stories of his commendable service record. "General Carter, I apologize for this treatment," she said, her voice filled with genuine remorse. She turned to Officer Miller, her face now hardened with anger. "Do you have any idea who this man is? He's a decorated U.S. Army general." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. The crowd murmured, their expressions shifting from confusion to realization. The officer's face turned pale, his confidence evaporating in an instant. "Lieutenant, I didn't realize," he stammered, clearly shaken. "That's because you didn't bother to find out," she replied coldly. She turned back to Nathaniel, her expression softening. "General Carter, again, I'm deeply sorry. This is not how we conduct ourselves." Nathaniel took a breath, his patience unwavering. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate your professionalism." The lieutenant wasted no time in removing the handcuffs, offering him a respectful nod. The crowd, realizing the gravity of what had just happened, broke into quiet applause, some expressing words of support. But General Carter simply stood there, a dignified figure amidst the chaos, his expression calm yet powerful. He looked directly at Officer Miller, his gaze penetrating. "Respect is something you earn, officer. Remember that." Part 3. A Lesson Learned. The fallout was swift and intense. News of the incident spread rapidly, with social media posts and videos capturing the entire event. The police department faced immediate backlash, demanding accountability and reform. Officer Miller was placed under investigation, and many in the community voiced their outrage. As for General Carter, he quietly returned to his life, never seeking attention or accolades for what he had endured. But the impact of that day stayed with him. It was a painful reminder of the work that still needed to be done, of the prejudices that persisted even in the most unexpected places. The lieutenant, deeply affected by the incident, sought to make amends. She reached out to General Carter, asking if he would be willing to speak to the officers in her department about his experiences, about respect, resilience, and the importance of integrity. Nathaniel, ever the humble leader, agreed. Not out of anger or resentment, but out of hope. He believed that by sharing his story, he could inspire change. And so one morning, he stood before a room filled with officers, sharing the story of his life, his service, and the lessons he had learned along the way. His words resonated deeply, especially with Officer Miller, who attended the talk. Overcome with remorse, Miller approached Nathaniel afterward, his head bowed. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quietly. "I made a terrible mistake, and I regret my actions." Nathaniel looked at him, his expression kind yet resolute. "Apologies are important, officer, but so are actions. Remember that respect and understanding are more powerful than any badge." From that day forward, Officer Miller changed. He became an advocate for equal treatment, a better listener, and a stronger ally for those who needed it most. And though Nathaniel never saw him again, he hoped that perhaps, in some small way, he had made a difference. In the end, General Carter continued his service, his quiet strength and inspiration to all who crossed his path. And though he never sought recognition, His actions spoke louder than words ever could, a testament to the power of integrity, respect, and the unwavering pursuit of justice.